that we should record the
No,
session. That's right. Okay. It's like she's everywhere. She's omnipresent, and I'm sure she'll be here with us soon. Oh, without further ado, I want to welcome, as you were, I don't know, some like 4 or 5 months ago, Nancy, was it that you
Something
did
like that.
a wonderful program on Mark Chagall, Nancy Potz from Jewish, I always want to say Jewish Education Alliance, but that's not it. Jewish
okay.
Artist.
Jewish Art Education.
Yeah, Art Education. That's right. That's right.
Okay, well, thank you, Mark, and thank you for the lovely musical interlude. I kept thinking about the dear departed David Crosby as you were singing.
There you go.
Having gone through that whole thing in the time since I have been with you all, you can tell where my musical affiliations lie. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And I'm going to do a couple of things to make the viewing experience a little more pleasant for everyone. I'm going to hide the video panel, the pictures of everyone on the screen, as well as these floating controls up here at the top, so that all you will see on the screen are my images. So let's do that, and then we will get started. Okay, well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me back for your regular Wednesday night gatherings. My name is Nancy, and I'm with Jewish Art Education. And JAE, as we refer to ourselves in this town of acronyms that we call the Washington, D.C. area, our mission as a nonprofit is to bring an awareness of the visual arts of the Jewish world to the wider world. And tonight we're going to do that with a look at the art of the holiday of Purim. And of course, as most of you know, Purim commemorates the saving of the Jewish people in ancient Persia in the 5th century BCE from Haman's plot to destroy, kill, and annihilate all of the Jews. It is celebrated in the month of Adar on a day known as Shushan Purim in Israel. You'll notice the opening slide here is quite colorful and vibrant, and that is a nod to the celebratory nature of the holiday. Before I launch into all of the artworks, I just want to mention my colleague Myrna Tech, pictured here with me on the screen. And I always give her acknowledgement at the beginning of all of my programs, because it is through her hard work and scholarship that I have all of the images I'm going to show to you this evening, as well as the information I'm referencing to tell you about them.
Nancy, can I ask a quick question?
Of course.
If somebody has a question, do you prefer them to raise their hand virtually or just unmute themselves and ask?
Let's go ahead and leave questions until the end of the program.
Okay, so if you have a question, make a note and bring it at the end.
Thank you very much, Mark. All right, well, we're going to begin with several images from a work created by the artist Leonard Baskin in 1984. And these are images he produced for a book that he created called The Five Scrolls. Baskin is best known really as a sculptor, but did a few of his works in 2 dimensions. For those of you in the Washington, D.C. area or who have visited Washington, I would recommend, if you haven't already, going down to see the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial on the National Mall by the Lincoln Memorial. One of Baskin's sculptures is part of that memorial, and it portrays people standing on a breadline during the Depression. So the Megilot Esther is featured here in this opening page for Baskin's work. The word Megillah is Hebrew for scroll. And this name is applied to 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, and they include Ruth, Song of Songs, Lamentations, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. This is because they were once read from separate scrolls. Only the book of Esther is still read in that form today and is often referred to as the Megillah with a capital T and a capital M. And it's worth noting that this is the only biblical book where the name of God is not mentioned once. It is thought that the scroll was sent to all parts of the kingdom in order to be read. Notice the Hebrew letters are also in bright colors and show multiple patterns to create a joyous and vibrant visual. Baskin is a master at Hebrew calligraphy, and you can see that he has embellished that calligraphy with some beautiful ornamentation. The next phrase from the Megillah, the opening phrase, is, "Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus." These first words of the Megillah we see here in Hebrew and in English, as well as Baskin's illuminated calligraphy. And if you look at each of the letters, you will notice that the first letters or last letters of each word have figures embellished on them. When I was an art history student back in the day, I took a class in early Christian and Byzantine art, and the paper I wrote for that class was on drolleries in Carolingian manuscripts. Now that seems like a mouthful of words, doesn't it? Drolleries are actually fanciful drawings that the monks placed in the margins of the manuscripts that they were copying and illuminating. And at first, people thought that those were just simply doodles or cartoons, but in fact, many of them have significance to the text, just like these images of the players in the Purim story have significance to this text. So let's meet those players in the story now with Leonard Baskin's help. This is Ahasuerus, and the story begins in the days of his reign over Shushan, a kingdom that stretched from India to Ethiopia and had 127 provinces. In the third year of his reign, he gave banquets for nobles and for the people of the kingdom, and they were given to show his riches and the glory of the kingdom. The artist here gives us a unique idiosyncratic approach to painting in watercolor. The king is shown with a red robe and a vibrant green turban. And these colors are opposite one another on the color wheel and create a dynamic, energetic image. And here is Vashti, Ahasuerus's first queen. The queen Vashti also gave banquets, and this was for the women in the royal house. On the seventh day, the king was merry with wine and commanded Vashti to show her beauty. These days, that can be interpreted in quite a number of ways. To me, it brings to mind the Me Too movement. He wanted to show her off to the people and to the nobles, but she refused. So she was quite a feminist. The king said to the sages, "What law should be applied to Queen Vashti for not obeying my command?" After one suggestion, he requested that Vashti appear before him once again, and once again she refused. A second suggestion resulted in a royal decree. This ruling banished her from her royal position and gave her place to someone else. This advice pleased the king. He sent letters throughout the kingdom to this effect. He asked for the beautiful young women of Shushan to come to the capital, and he held a competition for them to vie for the royal position. Baskin used the same colors here as he had for Ahasuerus to depict Vashti, but they are somewhat subdued in their tonality. Perhaps he saw them as being of equal importance. And next we come to Mordecai. In Shushan, there was a Jew named Mordecai, and he had brought up his cousin Hadassah after her parents had died. The name Hadassah may be translated to the name Esther. Esther was one of the young women brought before the king, and she pleased him and received kindness from him. She did not reveal who her people were or who her kindred were, and Mordecai had cautioned her in this regard. Notice how quiet, warm, and soft the colors are, which Baskin chose to depict Mordecai. Queen Esther is our next cast member, and the king loved Esther above all other women. He set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Then the king gave a great banquet for all of his nobles, and he granted a remission of taxes to the provinces, and he gave gifts as befits a king. Our 20th century Western minds associate the color white with purity, and that may be why the artist shows Esther wearing white garments. However, he adds the letters of her name in vibrant red to show the energy of her actions. And now get your groggers ready. We're going to look at Haman for a moment. 2 of the king's servants attempted to kill the king, but they were unsuccessful. As a result, Ahasuerus promoted his servant Haman, and he became chief among all of the other king's servants. The king then commanded that everyone bow down to Haman, but Mordecai refused. This filled Haman with rage. He did not want to harm just Mordecai alone, but in fact wanted to exterminate all of the Jews. And that was all of the Jews throughout the entire kingdom. And it happened in the first month of the Hebrew calendar, which of course is Nisan. This was in the 12th year of the king's reign. A put or lot was cast before Haman, and Haman told the king that a certain people did not keep his laws. Therefore, he thought that they should be destroyed. The king took the ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, and told Haman to do as he pleased. It was done and sealed with the king's ring. Letters went out to kill and exterminate all of the Jews, and this took place on the 13th day of Adar, the 12th month. Baskin clearly depicts Haman's nastiness, cruelty, and callousness in this mean-spirited, hot, red, and angry face. And I have one more image from Leonard Baskin of Mordecai. Here he is portrayed in sackcloth. Mordecai heard all that had happened and rent his clothes, and he put on sackcloth and ashes and went to the center of the city and cried bitterly. When Esther heard of this, she too was greatly distressed, and she sent a message to Mordecai. He replied by telling her what was to happen to the Jews, and he asked her to go to the king. He asked that she appeal to him on behalf of her people. Baskin shows Mordecai in colors associated with sadness. Yet he has one hand that is reaching toward the viewer and is alive with warmth and possibility. So now we're going to move away from the images by Baskin and look at some additional images. The first one is this Judeo-Persian image from the 18th century, showing Queen Esther before King Ahasuerus. Esther knew that it was against the law to ask to see the king. She would risk her life just by doing so, and she was hesitant. Mordecai said that she too would be included in the annihilation, and asked her to consider why she had been placed in her royal role, thinking that perhaps this was the reason. When the king saw Esther, she held favor in his sight. He wanted to know her request, and he promised her anything she wanted. He was willing to give her up to half of his kingdom. She asked that the king and Haman come to a banquet, and they accepted and did so. So here the influence of Persian art with its richly repetitive pattern is displayed in this image of Queen Esther before the king. And we see Esther on the left and the king on the right. And if you look just behind Esther on the left, you see a very angry looking figure holding an axe. And perhaps that is a depiction of Haman. We also have this image from Malchus Zeldis, made in 1976, of Esther and Ahasuerus. At the banquet, the king inquired about her request, and Esther asked that they attend a second banquet the following night. In the meantime, Haman reveled in his newfound power, but Mordecai was still mightily vexed, and mightily vexing him. The king ordered that a gallows be built to hang Mordecai. And that night the king couldn't sleep. He read the book of records of the chronicles of his empire, and he discovered that Mordecai was the one to be thanked. For it was Mordecai who had discovered the plot by the two servants to kill him. At the banquet, the king had a question. He asked what honor was to be bestowed on Mordecai for this. And Esther said that nothing had been done. When Haman came to the banquet, the king asked him a question. What should be done to the man the king delights to honor? So this is a 20th century work by a self-taught artist and can be thought of as in a naive or primitive style in terms of its illustration. And once again, if you look on the left-hand side of the image, in the back, you see a figure with a pointed black hat whose arms are in shackles, and that is a depiction of Haman. So now we're going to step back even further in time to a site called Dura-Europos, and this is a 3rd century image titled The Persian King Arrives. Haman said that royal clothing, a crown, and a horse should be given to the man the king wished to honor. So attired, Haman said that he should be led through the Shushan streets. Then the king ordered Haman to do this for Mordecai. Haman was mortified and very angry about this new development, but he went to the banquet which Esther had prepared. This image is from a wall painting that is from the synagogue in Dura-Europos, which laid at a crossroads of the Silk Route in what is now Syria. It is identified as Arrival of the Persian King, and it may depict Mordecai on horseback in royal attire. This painting was created in the 3rd century of the Common Era, and it shows Eastern influences. The figures are symbolic of the characters in the story, and they are not individualized and do not show any emotion. So here we have the ark and walls at Dura-Europos, again, from the 3rd century. The site was a Roman garrison town on the eastern frontier. An earthquake covered it in the late 3rd century, and it was only rediscovered in the 1920s. The many paintings on these walls are the earliest known figurative artworks based on stories from the Hebrew Bible, and they may have served as precursors to works of later artists. When I look at these works here at Dura-Europos, it always reminds me of the chapel decorated by Giotto, who is considered the father of the Renaissance. Purim festival is another image from Dura-Europos. At the banquet, the king asked Queen Esther again for her request, and she asked that her life be spared as well as those of her people. She explained that she and her people were to be exterminated, and the king asked who had done this. And Esther said that the adversary and enemy was the wicked Haman. Here we see a throne that is decorated with lions and eagles, and it may be based on a biblical description of King Solomon's throne. It is clear that the king is shown here with his queen on a raised platform and is being given a written request or statement. Our next image is by the artist Harry Lieberman and was made in 1968 and is titled Mordecai and Haman. He is another self-taught or naive artist. The king's wrath was not abated until Haman was hanged, and this was done on the gallows that had originally been prepared for Mordecai. Then the king took off his ring and gave it to Mordecai, and also held out his golden scepter to Esther. It was written that Mordecai commanded the Jews, and this was sealed with the king's ring. The Jews were glad on the 13th of Adar. Then Esther asked that Haman's 10 sons also be hanged, and that was done. So this self-taught artist, this folk artist, has made a painting that is almost like a medieval painting, in which many parts of the story are told in one canvas. So on the left, we see Esther holding one of her women's banquets. In the center, we see Haman with the horse getting ready to lead Mordecai through the Shushan streets. And on the right, we see a grouping of figures, which look to be as if they are from a congregation, or perhaps they are a choir, and a figure next to them, to the left, is draped in a tallis. And it is possible that that could be a depiction of Mordecai. This work was made in 1843 by an artist named Yosef Zvi Geiger, who was an Israeli artist in pre-State of Israel-Palestine. The curious thing about this work is it is an oil painting on glass. The 15th day of Adar was made a day of celebration and gladness, and Mordecai wrote all of this down. He said to observe the 14th and 15th of Adar by feasting and joy. And he also said that Jews should send portions to one another, and they should give gifts to the poor. And the holiday was called Purim. And it continues today, along with the reading of the scroll of Esther, the Megillah. This 19th century artist dressed all of the players in contemporary costumes. And he also used a cell approach, which is like cartoons done today. And we're going to look at a close-up now of the figures of King Ahasuerus' soldiers. The painting is on glass, and we notice that the king's soldiers are dressed in Ottoman uniforms. And I had an audience member yesterday when I gave this program for a group at a senior living community who told me that she has attempted to do oil paintings on glass and told me how difficult a process that is. Megilot Seterim, MOSh-niks Purim is the title of this work made in 1734 in Amsterdam. It is a Purim custom to stage a Purim parody, and this began in medieval times. It is in the festive spirit of the holiday, and groups of Purim spielers or players would go from door to door, extemporaneously enacting the Purim story in farcical fashion. This tradition was most active in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Sometimes more elaborate plays were presented in Yiddish. The players often went from shtetl to shtetl, community to community, and their productions were quite popular. The story of Esther is the most popular subject of these parodies, and it was frequently staged with contemporary or community twists, just as Purim parodies are staged today, often using the scores of famous Broadway musicals. Proceeds from these performances would usually go to charity, and this was in accordance with the obligation required by Jewish law. The scroll of Esther mentions that Jews give, quote, gifts to the poor. MOSh-niks Purim is a parody on the Talmud. The text is on the theme of drinking wine, and it was written in the 14th century. Levi ben Gershom wrote the Megilot Seterim in the same period, and he was from Provence, and it was known as the Scroll of Secrecy. Revelers drink until they cannot distinguish between Mordecai and Haman. This 18th century work reflects characteristics which place the activity in a Dutch setting. The checkered floor and the unusual hats and clothing are from the period. And this work was made in Eretz Yisrael in the 19th century and titled Purim Celebration. The spirit of celebration surrounding this merry holiday is unique, as Jews generally do not drink alcohol to excess throughout the year. The only exception, of course, is ceremonial wine. On Purim, they are urged to drink ad dalo yada. That is, until they cannot tell the difference between cursed Haman and blessed Mordecai. This illustration is also specific in its time and place. We notice the way the figures are dressed. Two of them are wearing fur-brimmed stremels, the Hasidic 17th century Polish hat. And there are also figures with Middle Eastern fezzes on, with a tassel hanging from them. So this is really a depiction of the variety of Jewish communities that came together for the celebration. This Purim mask was made by Ita Aber sometime between 1977 and 1978. Yeshiva students would do imitations of their rabbis and teachers. The Yeshiva Purim highlight was the reading of the Purim Torah. And these are frivolous dissertations on the Talmud and Jewish law. They often used witty parodies of Talmudic texts. A special Purim guide was also composed and publicly read, and it was a parody of the Passover Haggadah used for the Seder service. Satirical poetry was also sung at these yeshiva festivities. The poems were set to simple, repetitive tunes, and sometimes Purim kings were crowned with pomp and circumstance. In Hasidic courts, the Purim rabbi was chosen on the first of Adar, and he was expected to conduct parodies of Hasidic rabbinic discourses. He was supposed to do this while sitting aside the Hasidic rabbi. This contemporary mask is made of lurex, which is embellished with embroidery, ribbon, and gold soutouche braid trim. In Israel today, adults dress up in costume for the celebratory holiday. And this Purim wine jug is from Syria and dates to the 19th century and is made of etched glass. The glass is actually amber in its color, so the base of it is dark and the etching creates the lighter tones. The inscription on the neck is in Arabic and the body inscription is in Hebrew, and only a few bottles of this type remain. The inscription on this bottle is the Kiddush for the Sabbath. The Arabic letters around the neck, however, are simply decorative. Because there is some misspelling on the few remaining jugs, it is thought that the glassworker was either illiterate of Hebrew or not Jewish. Well, you can't celebrate Purim without groggers because we need to make as much noise as possible when reading the Megillah to drown out Haman's name. And I have a few groggers to show you. This one is from Vienna, Austria from 1826. It has the congregants turn these noisemakers to drown out the name of Haman, and this has come to symbolize the various enemies of the Jews. Notice there is a clown hat on top of this Viennese noisemaker. Groggers have been made of many different materials, most commonly from wood or silver, like this one. This is a 19th century grogger from Russia. Notice the grogger depicts Haman being hung in the rondel. So when you turn the crank, that rondel will spin and make the noise. And here is another that was made in Cyprus in 1947. Purim noisemakers are sounded by children and some adults, and the noise is to drown out the name of wicked Haman. This grogger was made in a detention camp in Cyprus in 1947, and the Nazi swastika as well as the German coin are symbols that equate Haman and Hitler. This work shows Haman and his 10 sons and comes from a mid-14th century northern German, a piece from northern Germany. The image of Haman and his 10 sons hanging from the gallows that was originally prepared for Mordecai is a popular tradition in northern Germany in the mid-14th century. This particular page comes from a work known as the De Castro Bible. This Bible contains a manuscript of the 5 books of Moses as well as the 5 scrolls. The weekly portion from the prophets are included as well. Nathaniel the scribe wrote the Bible, and Levi ben David vocalized it in January of 1344, so he spoke it aloud in that year. By contrast, this is Leonard Baskin's version of the same image of the hanging of Haman's sons that he made in 1972 as a precursor to his 1984 full rendition of the 5 scrolls. The artist hangs Haman's sons amidst the text. This modernist approach informs his aesthetic. We also find images related to Purim in minhagim books, or books of customs. These were made beginning in the medieval period through about the 18th or early 19th century, and served as guides for the Jewish community to the celebration and rituals of Judaism. The Purim revelers here wear Venetian carnival costumes, as this minhagim book is from Venice, and these are similar to the costumes worn for the Commedia dell'arte. A couple of weeks ago on CBS Sunday Morning, Seth Dome did a piece on Venetian mask makers. And if you haven't seen that yet, I would definitely suggest checking it out. You can find it on their YouTube channel. This print shows Purim celebration and was made by Shlomo Maduro in Amsterdam in the 1700s. Another custom on Purim was burning of Haman in effigy, and it provided a relief from the constant sadistic oppression of the Jews. And these customs date back to Talmudic times. It was practiced in Macedonia, Byzantium, medieval Germany, and Italy. It's interesting to note that the celebrants in this woodcut are dressed in jester costumes consistent with the royal court. The Hebrew Ball at the Music Academy in New York is the subject of this illustration done on March the 14th of 1865 and published in a publication in Waltham, Massachusetts. This is an illustration of a Purim ball held on that date, and it was an extravagant example of masquerade parties that were held. Charity balls were popular in the mid-19th century in America, and the Purim ball was a highlight of the New York Jewish social scene. And if you look closely at the image, you will see partygoers dressed in lots of very impressive costumes, my favorite being the fella over on the right-hand side, sort of set back a little bit from the front of the piece, who is dressed like a dreidel. It is also interesting to note that this is an event that happened in New York City, but was in a publication in Massachusetts. The interest of people beyond the confines of New York indicates the importance of this event. Purim Ball, New York, 1881, is an announcement for Purim Ball that would benefit the building fund of the Hebrew Benevolent and Orphan Asylum Society. And on a personal note, my husband's late father was actually lived at that orphan asylum for a short period of time with his sister, 2 of the 5 children in the family, after his father died suddenly in 1918. Here we have a photograph of a Purim ball held in Munich, Germany in 1932. And this is a photo of the Jewish Choral Society of Munich. Clearly, they are all in costume for their Purim celebration. Although the custom of American adults dressing in costume is not prevalently practiced, currently it was in the past and in other parts of the world as well. This is an advertisement for a Purim carnival held in Tel Aviv in the 1930s. The new culture in Eretz Yisrael was rooted in Haskalah, the concept of enlightenment and rationalism. It was nourished on nationalism and modernization, and emphasized the difference from the old Yiddish culture. Nostalgia was the foundation for an old approach in Eastern Europe. This poster is clearly in a modernist idiom. It is done in flat pattern with clear, clean shapes that characterize it. And here we have a photograph titled Purim Arrives, taken in Mea Shamir in the 1980s. In Jerusalem, Purim is celebrated on a day called Shushan Purim, and that is on the 15th of Adar. This photograph is of a typical Hasidic family in Jerusalem. The children are dressed up and hold mishlot manot, or gifts for the poor. And those are traditional gifts of food. The father wears a frosh Dremel hat and his black coat, which is the attire usually worn for the Sabbath and for festivals. And this is a Purim wall decoration created in the late 19th century by Sarah Edel Weissenberg in Jerusalem. And I find it amazing that this is made of paper that has been embroidered. It's perforated paper. Knowing my klutziness, if I tried to do a piece such as this, it would end up in a ball of shreds. You'll notice that she also uses that cell-like fashion in order to convey the story. The artist Marc Chagall, who we talked about the last time I was with you all, gives us this image of a Purim celebration. And this is from the very early part of his career, about 1916 to 1918. And it was inspired by the childhood memories of his wife, Bella. He set this Purim celebration in a typical Russian village. The children bear gifts of food for friends, family, and neighbors. The custom of giving gifts survives today among some Jews. They send friends cakes, fruit, and Hamantaschen. The latter is the German word meaning Haman's pocket. And of course, these are the favorite triangular pastries with fruit, cheese, or poppy seeds. In the past, special plates were used, and they were often made of pewter and decorated. They had quotations or scenes from the Book of Esther. An emphasis was placed especially on the triumph of Mordecai. Some congregations had special collection cups used for Purim. This is an early work by Chagall, but through the flatness, bold colors, and skewed perspective, it shows the combination of the influences of Cubism and his memory of folk customs. And this is a Purim wall decoration made by Meyer Schwartz in Vienna in 1929. You see a scene in the center of a lot of gentlemen dressed in their Hasidic garb, eating and drinking and dancing. And there are a whole crowd of folks on the right in the doorway waiting to come inside, or even observing what's going on. On either side, we see rondels or circular areas that bear the images of the Lion of Judah, the protector of the Jewish people. And above, we see images of fish. And when I first looked at this image, I was quite curious about those images. But in doing a little more research, I found that the astrological sign of Pisces falls during the Hebrew month of Adar. Chaim Gross gives us this work called Feast of Lot's Purim. And this is from a book that he created in 1967 titled Jewish Holidays, Customs, and Traditions. Gross, like Baskin, is primarily known as a sculptor. Yet this lighthearted, sketchy depiction of Purim captures the spirit of the holiday. And I have two.
Can I just say something? Oh, sorry.
Sure, go ahead.
I knew Chaim very, very, very well.
Oh, did
I saw
you?
him all the time growing up, and my apartment's filled with things that he signed for me and gave me.
Oh
as
my
presents.
goodness.
I loved him and Rini, and I've never seen that before. So
Oh, I'm glad I could show you something new of
that's
his
very
work.
special.
That is very special. We'll talk about that at the conclusion, perhaps. But thank you for sharing that with us. I want to return now to Malka Zeldis for two more images. This is Dressed for Purim from 1985. An almost childlike simplicity characterizes this joyous painting. Purim symbols such as groggers, masks, and costumes are evident. The artist's choice of vibrant primary colors, red, yellow, and blue, creates a stimulating and happy environment for the celebration. And this work by Zeldis from 1995, so 10 years later, is called Salach Manot. Using high intensity or bright colors in a naive and primitive style, the artist shows their tradition of giving gifts to others. The children in the two families are attired in Purim costumes, while the elderly grandfather waits for them to join him at the table. And one of my audience members noted the other day that there aren't enough chairs around that table for the number of people in the scene. Zeldis does like to include her grandfather in a lot of her images, as he was her inspiration for following her artistic endeavors. This work is by Christian Boltanski and was made in 1988 and titled The Festival of Purim. It is composed of 10 black and white and color photographs, along with 41 lights and a tin box. Memory and remembrance are central concepts in Judaism, and they are also at the core of most Jewish festivals. On Purim, Jews remember their narrow escape. They also remember the occasions on when Haman did prevail. That is a symbolic Haman, as he has had many successors. The artist deals with darker aspects of this festival. The faces of the children at a Purim party are of children at a Purim party at a Jewish school in Paris, and they were taken in 1939, just before most of them were killed by the Nazis. They did not die of natural causes, but of course they were murdered. Their festive costumes are the only thing that gives them an individual identity. For Boltanski, photographs possess the connotation of death. And it was Roland Barthes, the philosopher, who coined the adage that photography is about death, because the moment that the photograph captures will never be there again. So it is like that moment has died. For Boltanski, this also had a special meaning. He said that these photographs have in common that they are simultaneously present and absent. The lights are associated with memorial lights that Jews burn to commemorate someone who has passed away. Boltanski's photographs are blurred, and the faces are anonymous, and they are symbols of the
Did Nancy, we lose Nancy? There you go.
I'm sorry?
I think we lost you for a moment, your audio.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm here. Can everyone hear me?
We can now. I think it was just about 5 to 7 seconds.
Okay, so Boltanski was born in 1944 in Paris on the day that the city was liberated. His Jewish father came out of hiding to register his birth. His non-Jewish mother had hidden his father. Christian chose to follow Judaism rather than following his mother's Christian faith. And this was a choice that most Jews did not have the luxury to make. These Purim plates were created in Amsterdam in 1785 and honor Rabbi Moses ben Aaron and his wife Baal. Their daughter and son-in-law commissioned the plates as a gift in accordance with the custom of giving gifts on Purim. The set of plates all have the same shape and border design. They even have the same interior frame for the various Hebrew phrases. And
Nancy,
yes.
excuse me. You're often talking, you're one slide ahead of what we see. So you're often describing something before we see what you're describing. So I don't know how it's out of sync for you.
It is not out of sync for me, but I will make sure to wait to speak until I know that the slide has been up for about a few seconds or so. How's that?
Good, good.
Sorry about that. Thank you for letting me know.
I forgive you.
So this is a salak manot plate made in France in the 18th century. The border text refers to the Purim mandate given to Esther in chapter 9, verse 22. That is to send portions to one another and gifts to the poor. The center has an illustration showing the humiliated Haman wearing his signature three-corner hat as he leads Mordecai wearing Haman's royal cloak on horseback. This salak manot plate was made in 1813 in Germany. You'll notice it is much simpler and much more austere in its design and execution. The base plate would have been purchased from a pewter craftsman who was non-Jewish, and then it was decorated by a Jewish artisan. And the reason for this is that Jews were not allowed to be members of the Pewter Guild during that time period. So now I have quite a few Esther scrolls to show to everyone. These are a group of Esther scrolls that date from the 17th to 19th century and come from the Middle East. The megilot are starkly plain as the Torah scroll itself.
Excuse me, Nancy, you're ahead of the slide that we can see.
Can you see
There,
the slide
now
of the megilot?
Now we see it.
Okay, I'll start again. Thank you. I'm so sorry. These megilot are starkly plain, like Torah scrolls. They are family-owned and are ornamented. Jewish artists generally did the illumination. The dramatic and exotic story of Purim lends itself to illustration. It provided material for the master illuminator and folk artist. There are no decorated megilot before the 16th century. It may mean that they just did not survive, or they may have not yet been discovered. Decorated megilot were rare in Oriental Jewish communities, so Oriental meaning communities of the Middle East. Figurative art was almost never seen on their megilot, and this is primarily due to the iconoclasm of the Muslim mainstream. Megilot of the 16th to 18th century in Italy are considered particularly special. The scrolls were kept in cases made of carved wood or silver, and they are commonly illustrated with scenes from the Book of Esther. These containers were a popular gift to the intended bridegroom. All right, does everyone see the Esther scroll from Amsterdam now on the screen? Let me know when you see it.
It's there.
Good, thank you. This Esther scroll was made by an artist named Salome d'Italia in Amsterdam in the 17th century. Salome d'Italia was born in Mantova, Italy, and came from a well-known family of printers. After the Austrian invasion, the Jews were expelled from the city. So he spent time in Venice before ultimately settling in Amsterdam. He made several different designs of Esther scrolls. Best known is the portal type that influenced many other artists. In this scroll, the text is written in round medallions. The architectural elements are not prominent. They are part of the repeating motif between the text rondelles, and they are accompanied by vases of flowers and rabbit heads. Above each medallion, a lion or bear menacingly eyes a lamb. The story of Esther is illustrated in the panels beneath the text. I'm waiting just a moment before I start to talk. Do we see the Italian early 17th century scroll now?
Yes.
Cool. This one is actually in the collection at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore. This Italian Esther scroll has segments that are parallel to Oriental scrolls, which are intended to be open to only one section at a time for contemplation and comprehension. And you'll notice the hands in the position of the priestly blessing over on the left in the illustration. And now we come to Aria Loeb Ben Daniel's Esther scroll. Do we see that one?
No.
Not yet?
Yeah, something must be wrong with your computer, Mel, because it's coming up for all of us.
Oh, I see. I'm still on the Esther scroll.
Yeah, it's a different scroll.
Okay.
Go ahead, Nancy.
I'm sorry that someone is having difficulty. I'll try to compensate as much as I can. This is a scroll made by Aryeh Loeb Ben Daniel of Guria in Italy in the mid-18th century. The figures between the text columns are Esther and Mordecai, and this scroll is a work of the Polish scribe artist who went to Italy. Mordecai is dressed in regal garb of a contemporary nobleman. The upper border shows birds and profiles from the Esther story. The lower border has small medallions with scenes from the story, and lions flank those medallions. This is a unique and one-of-a-kind scroll. The artist combined the folk images and style of Poland with the curvilinear approach used in Italy to create an integrated composition. Our next Esther scroll comes from Germany from the early 18th century, and it is in the collection of the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. The artist for this scroll is probably the most famous artist of them all, anonymous. There are 3 other known scrolls done in a similar hand. The characters in the Purim story are portrayed in 18th century dress. Zodiac rondelles frame the text, and a man points to Pisces, the sign of the Hebrew month of Adar. This is the month when Purim is celebrated. Using the zodiac may refer to lots cast to select the month. This is when Haman wanted to annihilate the Jews. So this work is done in a medium called gouache. And for those of you who are not familiar with that medium, it is an opaque water-based paint similar to poster paint or watercolor. Our next Esther scroll is from Corfu, Greece, from 1708. The Megillah is the only biblical book decorated with human figures. Corfu, Greece, was the apex of decoration of Esther scrolls and ketubot, or marriage contracts, in the 18th century. The imagery was strongly influenced by Italian stylistic conventions. Our next Esther scroll is from Italy from 1700, and used to be part of the collection at the B'nai B'rith Museum here in Washington. And that collection has actually been absorbed into the collection of the new Capitol Jewish Museum, which is currently being built down near the National Building Museum. This megilot is barely 2 inches high. It has scenes from the Purim story and celebrates the triumph of virtue and faith. They support courage over wickedness and cowardice. It may have been intended to be used for a traveling merchant. And the use of multiple colors of the illustration and column dividers is typical of Italian Esther scrolls. And now we're going to look at a close-up of the image on this scroll of Mordecai on horseback. And hopefully you can all see him now. Here is Mordecai being paraded through the streets on his royal horse and wearing his royal crown and robe and carrying his scepter. The stylistic approach is somewhat naive as the illustrator does not employ the use of linear perspective, an artistic technique which was strongly characteristic of Italian work at the time. After the Renaissance, in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, Jews were not allowed to be members of guilds. And so he or she may not have been a fully trained artist and may have actually been a folk artist. Our next scroll of Esther comes from northern Italy from the mid-18th century. This Megillah's architectural composition is very reminiscent of ketubot. And the area of northern Italy saw a renaissance of illuminated marriage contracts at this time. The text is framed in a highly decorated archway, and allegorical figures and narratives are typical of both manuscripts. Below the text are additional scenes from the Esther story. This is an early Esther scroll from Italy from the early 18th century. And this one is also part of that collection, which is now with the Capitol Jewish Museum. Depictions of the main characters of the Book of Esther are found at the capitals of each of the columns. And this image is a further detail of that same scroll. A vase with flowers surmounts each image, and actors' masks are below each column. Between the columns are depictions of the story of Purim. and they are above and below the text. Another Esther scroll from that same collection is this one, and it has illuminations at the beginning of the reading, and spiral columns separate each segment. The spiral columns are a visual reference to Boaz and Joachim, and those two columns were at the entrance to King Solomon's temple. A Jewish craftsman who lived in Muslim lands probably did the highly complex filigree work and setting of the cabochon stone on the pole on the end, which you would use to pull the scroll out of its holder. And this is a beautiful Esther scroll from Eastern Europe from the early 19th century. Another item in that same collection with the Capital Jewish Museum. Can't wait for them to open their new building. Esther scrolls contain the biblical book of Esther and are illustrated with narrative scenes and decorative motifs. When the scroll is fully unrolled, only then the reader will begin to chant the text. And here is an example from Izmir, a city in Turkey. And this Esther scroll and sheet of blessings was created in 1873. The megillah and gold filigree case were a wedding gift made for the son-in-law of a wealthy Izmir merchant. And this type of filigree originated in Izmir. And next we have a German example from 1834 with a leather case. You'll notice that the scroll is not decorated, it is just the calligraphy, but the case is the element here that gets the decorative attention. And this flowered Purim case and Esther scroll is from Eastern Europe and dates to 1840. And is made of silver that has been embossed, chased, and cast. The silver case bears a Vienna 1840 hallmark. The double-headed eagle in a circle indicates an origin elsewhere, and it may have been in the political sphere of Austria or perhaps Poland. And this Esther scroll was made in Jerusalem in 1927 by Ze'ev Rabban. Architectural frameworks, along with illustrations of scenes in the story, are common motifs in decorated Esther scrolls. And artists probably used book or stage sets and architectural plans as models. Rabban's work is distinctive and easily recognized by those familiar with his style. Elements of Art Nouveau are combined with beadwork and filigree influences from the East. This Megillah case is from the Bezalel school in Eretz Yisrael and was made in the 1950s. Jews are obligated to hear the Megillah read aloud, and congregants sometimes follow along from embellished versions. Some are in elaborately carved wood, silver, or ivory cylinders. This case depicts King Ahasuerus and Queen Esther in the top register, while Haman is shown leading Mordecai through the streets on the royal horse. The reticulated repoussé and filigree are characteristic of the Bezalel Academy of Art in Jerusalem. And repoussé refers to the technique of hammering the metal from the backside to create a relief image on the front side of the metal. Our next megilot case was made by Moshe Slimlovici in Tel Aviv in the 1950s. And the decorative element used on this silver case is one called nielo. And that is a substance that is a mixture of sulfur, copper, silver, and lead, and is inlaid on engraved or etched metal, especially silver. And the effect of this dark enamel makes the sparkle of the silver stand out. This image is called The Great Morning and was made in Tel Aviv in 1947. It is an illustration to a book of Esther And it shows Mordecai as he has gone to the center of town to warn the Jews about what is to happen to them should Haman's plot not be foiled. An Adasir book from Persia in the 17th century is our next item, and that is a Judeo-Persian book. The story of Esther is interwoven into a classic 10th century tale. The latter is about the history of Persia. The heroes are Adasir, who is identified with King Ahasuerus. Here, the king seeks a new queen after banishing Vashti. The Adasir book is not a megillah. It is a manuscript composed in Judeo-Persian, and they were originally made beginning in 1332. The work is based on a work written in the 10th century, which is a classic work of Persian culture. The first chapter of the Adasir book is excerpted here, and the story of Esther is combined with Jewish and Muslim legends. The dispersion of Jews throughout the world is highlighted in this manuscript. The ability to adopt and adapt to the aesthetic of the mainstream culture, in this case Persian culture, is a fascinating aspect of the Jewish world. And these two Purim dolls were made in Yemen in the 1930s. They represent Haman and Zeresh, the villains in the Book of Esther. On Purim, young boys pulled them through the streets in a cart. Laughter and explosive noisemakers and toy guns accompanied them. Eventually, the dolls were kicked off or burned, and this is to symbolically smite Haman. Now, for those of you who are hungry, this may or may not be an appealing photograph. This is a Purim bread from Morocco, known as a cabeza de Purim or boyoza, and the bread was baked in a variety of shapes and forms. However, they always contain eggs in their shells. The number of eggs referred to the number of children in the family, and they symbolize the eyes of Haman. Perhaps I would prefer probably to eat Hamantaschen rather than this, but the bread does look delicious. And our final image this evening is this Purim Shviti from Kurdistan, made in the 19th century. This Shviti has songs and prayers related to Purim, and it also features a depiction of Psalm 67, which is micrographically written. Micrography is the process of writing a text in very tiny letters, and these form the configuration of shape of some recognizable object. Many people consider this the only unique Jewish art style. Thus, the psalm form of the seven-branched menorah is created to the left in the center. The psalm acknowledges God's presence, asks God to show us favor, and states that he should be revered to the ends of the earth. A shviti is a plaque with the words, I have set shviti, the Lord before me always. And this comes from Psalm 16, verse 8. These plaques hang in the home and in the synagogue, and many other verses and motifs are interwoven within this verse from Psalms. What better way to end a presentation on Purim than by viewing an art object that emphasizes the presence of the Lord, whose name is never mentioned directly in the scroll of Esther. And as we like to end all of our presentations, it is said that the love of art cannot be taught, it can only be caught. And I hope we've made the art of Purim contagious to all of you today. And I encourage you to visit us online. We have a brand new website that just premiered at the end of last year at www.jarted.org. And you can also find us on Facebook and Instagram. So I'm going to end there and bring everybody back up. Thank you. If any of you have any questions or comments, I'd be delighted to take them. And who was my audience member who had the connection with Chaim Gross?
That's Marlena.
Marlena.
Yeah.
What a special thing to have in your life.
Yeah. He and Rini were incredibly special people. They spent their lives surrounded by art and artists. They lived, have you ever been to their townhouse where they lived in
No,
Manhattan?
I haven't.
Well, they lived in Greenwich Village forever. And they had a townhouse, and the entire thing was salon style. Like from floor to ceiling, there was art everywhere, from every style all over the world. And they traded art with artists from all over. I mean, every artist you could possibly imagine, they had art from. And he was born and came to this country from circumstances that were so horrific, they're unimaginable. But him and the Sawyer brothers were best of friends. If one of them had a slice of bread, they would share it. Ultimately, these people who had nothing became so famous and amongst the most famous Jewish artists of the 20th, of the generation. And Chaim is in the permanent collection of the Met. He's here when you go into the Portrait Gallery, and you see to the left, they have the acrobats.
Right.
And it's incredible.
My great uncle, one of my my paternal grandfather's brothers, was an art collector. And I don't recall if he had any works by Gross. I'll have to ask my dad's cousin, Gerald, if he remembers. Unfortunately, I can't ask my father because he passed away several years ago. But I do remember going to his house in Springfield, Mass, in Longmeadow, and seeing all of the works. And I am sure he must have had at least one piece by Gross in his collection. I'll have to try and find out. I do recall he had some pieces by Soutine, another Jewish artist, as well as many other artists. And I was lucky enough to inherit a work on paper by Mary Cassatt from my father that he had inherited from his uncle. Doc and Rose did not have any children, so they gave pieces of their collection to their nieces and nephews, and then a good portion of the collection was donated to the Art Museum in Springfield, Mass. Any other questions or comments?
Bina.
Yeah.
There was some Arabic on the Shaviti, and I thought that was really interesting. Can you talk about that at all?
I don't know a whole lot about the Arabic on the Shviti. That would take a little bit more digging on my part. But as you noticed with the wine jug from Syria, there was Arabic decorating the neck, whereas the body of the jug had the Kiddush in Hebrew.
Right.
So there was a lot of cross-pollinization, if you will, between artistic styles. The one thing that I always like to remind audiences is that art created by each artist is informed by their own environment. I was having this discussion with a group this morning when I was giving another presentation, when one of the women in the group pointed out that all of the figures in the various works of art that actually were related to Passover were Caucasian. And of course, if you are an artist, say, in places in Europe where there was not, during those earlier times, a multicultural citizenry, the artist is going to depict what they know.
Right.
The same way that architectural pieces borrow from each other. So we often see synagogue buildings, for example, that have elements that remind us of church architecture and vice versa. So the artists were really drawing from their own experience and their own surroundings and environment.
And the other thing that I noticed was one of the scrolls had a whole, I was fascinated when I was in Israel looking at old synagogue floors that had astrological signs on them, and that there was a whole thing.
The signs of the astrological phases are very prevalent in a lot of Jewish art, especially older Jewish art. The astrology was directly related. There were parallels between the astrological signs and the Hebrew months, etc. And so astrological signs are often shown. I really enjoy that one wall decoration that had the image of the men at the table and the men dancing, that had very prominent fish at the top, which of course are the sign of Pisces, which falls during the month of Adar.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Nancy and the group. I have 15 Baskin Haggadot in a box. They were stored in a basement for 15 years when I was actively working across the world. So I'm not going to use them. And they have a slightly moldy smell. But if you know of anyone who's interested in Baskin Haggadot, I don't know if they're still popular because they're about 50 years old.
Huh,
So
that's
anyway.
so interesting. That's so interesting. That might be something to perhaps put on some sort of listserv or share group that maybe wants to acquire them from you.
Okay.
Thank you, Mel. And thank you so much, Nancy, for
You are very welcome.
another wonderful evening. I don't know about for everybody, but the time just flies by when you've been with us. I just wanted to point out a couple of things, since we're not going to be celebrating Purim together as a community. Some tidbits that might be interesting. First of all, I put a link in the chat for examples of Purim bread. And I need to point this out to Renee, although I don't think she's going to be into it. And one of those things in there is it was so weird looking with the eggs beneath the lattice work of. So check that out because I'd forgotten all about that, Nancy. So thanks for reminding. The main thing I wanted to point out is this. Well, here is a question. True or false? Getting drunk is one of the 4 mitzvot of Purim. How many of you say that's true? Scott is nodding his head no.
I'm going to say it's true.
Nancy says it's true. Everybody, anybody else, put a wave to me if you think it's true. If okay, Mel doesn't know. Bina's got a thumb down. Okay. So we should be aware, of course, that that getting drunk on Purim is problematic for many communities, right? Of people who are now abstinent from drinking for a variety of reasons. Adlo yoda, until you don't know the difference between Mordechai and Haman, can be reached by meditating in a non-dual fashion, which is why drinking wine. And there's disagreements about how much wine you should drink. You should never, ever get drunk until your really head is spinning, right? But more so, I mean, there's a wonderful expression, Yayin nichnas v'sodot yatsa. Wine goes in and secrets come out. But that doesn't have anything to do with why we drink on Purim. It's really so that we enter into that state of non-duality. So let's hold the fact that we don't have to drink at all to enter into that state. So the answer is that it is not one of the mitzvot that is listed as the 4 mitzvot of Purim, which is our reading or hearing the Megillah, sending mashloach manos, gifts like gift baskets. We're always very lucky. Some friends in the neighborhood drop off gift baskets for us. A Purim Suda, a festive meal, and then matanot evyonim. That's sending gifts to the needy, to the poor. Those are all mentioned in the Megillah. They're all drawn from the Megillah itself. Of course, it's rabbinical that we have to hear Megillat Esther. And one of the things I want to mention is that Purim is always in juxtaposition with this Parsha Tetzaveh that we're reading this Shabbat. Interesting thing about that is that, as you mentioned, Nancy, that God is nowhere mentioned. God's name is not mentioned in the book of Esther, right? Now, if you listen to the word Esther, the word is hiddenness. Hester panim means a hidden face. So there is an author understood to be divinity behind the scenes working all of the time, right? The same is true of this week's Parsha. It's not Hashem, but it's Moshe, who's not mentioned in the whole description of the priestly garments. So Moshe's kind of like has to take a step back with great humility, and whether he's steaming on the side that his brother's going to get all this kavod, we don't know what's going on in his mind. But certainly he doesn't get to dress up like them in all of that garb. Last but not least, Purim Yom Kippurim. So question. Bean is going, so Yom Kippurim is a day like Purim. Why is it a day like Purim? I'm not going to go into an entire answer. You have something, Devorah? You have an answer?
Well, it was about who would live and who would die.
Oh, well, that's a great answer, but it's not the one I'm looking for. Or it's, okay, so what happens on Yom Kippur, of course, is that we fast until we hopefully reach that level and that consciousness of non-duality, so that we let go of our physicality, and we are imitating like the angels. And it's like a rehearsal for our deaths, the deaths that never consummated on Purim. Right. So there's a lot of parallels. It's really interesting if you want to look them up. I'm sure you can Google something and find that. And I think that's all I wanted to mention. Except for in your Boltanski, was it, Nancy?
The Christian Boltanski, yes.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about remembering and how that comes up in so much of the cycle of our lives, the cycle of our calendar, and so we keep in mind that we're supposed to remember what Amalek did to us, right? Don't forget. And Amalek is credited, or actually Haman is a direct lineage to Amalek. So in both situations, those who sought to harm us. So there's that very strong connection there as well. Nancy, thank you so much.
You are very welcome.
I'll have to look.
If I could just mention one other thing. There is a major exhibition opening this week at the National Gallery of Art on the work of Philip Guston, a very prominent 20th century Jewish artist. This is an exhibition that actually was supposed to take place about 2 years ago, but was pulled from the exhibition schedule temporarily due to the George Floyd murder protests. The exhibition has been reworked to address some what were thought to be at that time problematic images. The National Gallery just released a video today on their YouTube channel, which is a great teaser for the show and gets into a little bit of the reasons why this exhibition was delayed. It was on view at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston most recently and is now opening at the gallery. Philip Guston was born Philip Goldstein in Canada. As a young man, his family moved to Los Angeles, where he befriended Jackson Pollock when they went to high school together. They were both expelled from school for distributing material that was derogatory towards the English department at the high school. Goldstein never went back to school, but eventually found his way to New York, where he and Pollock became acquainted once again and worked together. And he subsequently changed his surname to Guston, which he thought was a little more ethnically neutral. So it's an exhibition that I've been looking forward to. I'm trying to figure out exactly what day next week I'm going to play hooky and go down to the gallery during the weekdays when it won't be so crowded. But I would encourage anyone who is interested to check it out. I'm not sure how long it's on view. Let me see if I have a note on that here. Usually exhibitions at the gallery are on view for quite a few months. I'm looking. Hang on one second. Philip Guston now will be on view from the it opened last week, the 26th of February, and is on view until August 27th. So I would highly encourage everyone to check out the exhibition.
Great. Thank you,
Mark,
everyone.
Mark,
Yes,
Mark,
Leslie,
I
go
just want to
ahead.
add one thing. I put it into chat just now, but there's a great novel that came out a couple of years ago. It's sort of the backstory of Esther. It's called The Great Game of Thrones by India Edgehill. And it's really an interesting and just interesting novel to read if anyone's interested. Thanks.
Thank you, Leslie.
Thanks, Leslie. Leslie, it's good to see you.
You too, Nancy. Someday I'll see you again in person.
So thank you, everyone.